Corporations are replacing our natural environment with an industrial landscape of wind turbines. One Nation will stand against sending children down a path of drug dependency and body mutilation to appease the gender cult. Leave our kids alone. The Trusted Digital Identity Bill is a global surveillance and control mechanism that profit-hungry corporations and power-mad politicians drafted and crafted. One Nation opposes this inhuman, dystopian future that the United Nations promotes as the Great Reset, and we condemn this Parliament for signing on to it. I called for Australia to reject the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and instead mount a great resist. Just like the koalas being euthanized to make way for wind turbines, or damaged solar panels leaking toxic heavy metals into waterways, the United Nations net zero plan again involves killing the environment to save it. I've been speaking about the fear, the oppression and the inhuman cruelty of our COVID response since July 2020. I promised to hound down those responsible, and I will continue relentlessly to keep that promise. You're about to be live with me, Senator Malcolm Roberts. Well, good afternoon. It's Friday again, and this time I'm coming to you from Canberra. So I'll be covering three topics. The Farmers' Reckless Renewables Rally, which was on Tuesday, in which I had an opportunity to speak, and what a wonderful energy was involved in the crowd there. People from all over the country coming together to show what they thought of needless transmission lines, solar and wind. The second thing I'll talk about is an update on the terms of reference inquiry that I moved a motion back in October last year, and it was successful. It got through the Senate, so the Senate is now, g'day mate, g'day Alan. So the Senate is now holding inquiries into the drafting the possible terms of reference for a possible future Royal Commission. And the third thing I'll talk about is the disgraceful events in Parliament yesterday when the government and the Greens passed the so-called closing the loopholes bill through the Senate, and I mean the Greens and Labor and Teal Senator Pocock work so closely together, and the Labor Party just accepts what the Greens feed them, and the Greens got through got an amendment through that will cause, if someone calls an employee after hours, they'll go to jail. So small business, look out for it. Anyway, Labor's now got to come through and amend their own bill and do that quickly. I mean, this is just so laughable, but it's serious because it's going to destroy many businesses around the country. So let's start, and I'll end up with some questions on notice, some Q&A at the end. So the Reckless Renewables Rally from the farmers. As I said, what a wonderful crowd it was. People really upset all around the country, particularly farmers and rural communities, about solar and wind destroying the environment, all in the name of saving it, destroying the environment, destroying communities, destroying prime farmland, just absolutely turning productive land into unproductive wasteland. And, you know, I pointed out when I spoke in front of them, I pointed out that we're up against parasitic globalists transferring money and land, vast quantities of land, from taxpayers and electricity users and communities to billionaires living parasitically off subsidies from us all. If you use electricity, if you eat food, you'll be subsidising these parasitic behaviours. Behaviours like those from Simon Holmes à Court, billionaire, Twiggy Forrest, billionaire, Mike Cannon-Brookes, billionaire, Ross Garnaut, 100 millionaire, he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Alex Turnbull, maybe a billionaire. And to stop this parasitic wealth transfer, to be effective for farmers and for all Australians in stopping solar and wind, we need to be united, consistent and blunt. So I proudly stood on the stage with a group of Queenslanders, and all of them were either farmers or a couple of politicians. For example, there was Gerard Rennick, Lou O'Brien and Cole Boyce, and I complimented them on standing up because a couple of years ago I wrote a letter to several members of Parliament saying, send me your advice on the evidence that shows that carbon dioxide from human activity needs to be cut. These are the people who replied. 9 replied saying that they'd never received any evidence. Never. And these are some long-standing politicians. George Christensen, Craig Kelly, Eric Abetz, Kevin Andrews, Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells from New South Wales, Gerard Rennick, Lou O'Brien, Bob Catter, and of course Pauline Hanson. And add my name to that, and there's 10 of us. I didn't mention Col Boyce there, but Col Boyce has been very, very consistent and strong, but he arrived in Parliament after I requested that evidence. I then covered a couple more topics. I've got to keep track on the time here because I've got a plane to catch pretty soon. So let me just get my clock back. Okay. I shared with the crowd the absolute fact, that every major climate and energy initiative was introduced by the Liberal Nationals, not Labor, the Liberal Nationals. When Labor comes into office, they ramp them up. I'll go through it. The first federal member of Parliament to raise climate change as an issue was Mr. Baum, a Liberal. The United Nations Kyoto Climate Protocol compliance was started by John Howard's government, a Liberal. The stealing of farmers' rights to use their own property so that Australia complied with the UN's Kyoto Protocol, John Howard's government, a Liberal. And yet John Howard was supposed to be one for states' rights and one for property rights. He was his government was that of a centralist and in fact a globalist. John Howard's governments have had a history of complying with UN Agenda 2030 as it's now known. Next one, the renewable energy target. Who introduced that? John Howard's government, a Liberal. The national electricity market, which is a national electricity racket, is a bureaucratically controlled racket that's abusing the market. There is no market. It's controlled, dictated to by bureaucrats. Who introduced that? John Howard's government, a Liberal. The first major party leader to introduce an emissions trading scheme, a carbon dioxide tax, was a Liberal, John Howard's government. And despite all of that, and there's more to come, but despite all of those contributions for destroying our country's electricity supply and grid and reliability and raising prices dramatically, trebling prices, 6 years after he was booted from office, John Howard was invited to address a London think tank, a skeptic think tank, and he said that on the topic of climate science, he was agnostic. He didn't have the scientific evidence. All of that was done with no basis, and there's still no basis. So let's continue with the other climate and energy policies. The signing of the UN's Paris Agreement, decimating our economy. Tony Abbott, a Liberal. Introducing the safeguard mechanism, which is the foundations for a global carbon dioxide tax, global. In 2015, Greg Hunt and Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, Greg Hunt as Environment Minister and Climate Change Minister, both Liberals. Ratification of the UN Paris Agreement, Malcolm Turnbull, a Liberal. 2050 net zero, the UN's 2050 net zero target, Scott Morrison's government, a Liberal. The Liberal Nationals introduced every major climate and energy fraud. Then each time a Labor government followed in government, Labor ramped it up. We need the Liberal National Party to reverse your climate and energy policies. We know the Nationals are split over it. Many of the Nationals want to get the hell out of the UN's 2050 net zero. Get back to science-based, data-driven policy. I hope more people within the Liberal National Party will follow Lou O'Brien, Gerard Rennick, and Col Boyce. And I know there are others who are climate skeptics and totally against the destructive solar and wind and excess transmission lines. By the way, I want to compliment Steve Nowakowski. He's got a Polish name. Sometimes they're hard to pronounce. Nowakowski. He stood up in front of the crowd there and admitted that he was formerly a Greenie and that he was passionately in favor of solar and wind until he saw the destruction. And now he is passionately against them. And he's open-minded, and he's changed his view entirely. So they're the things that were discussed, that I discussed, along with a few other things. Because what we have to remember is that, as Thomas Jefferson said, and my good friend, the late Professor Tim Ball, the Canadian climatologist, who I think is the world's best opponent of climate fraud, or was until he died in 2022, he reminded me of American President Thomas Jefferson's statement, "There can be farms without cities, yet there can be no cities without farms. No farmers, no food. Disrupted farmers, expensive and scarce food. To save farmers and food production, end solar and wind lies. End the excessive transmission. Stop solar and wind." I just want to point out a fact that Steve Nowakowski gave me. You know, it's so obvious. Some of these things are so obvious we miss them. At peak electricity usage times, which is early in the morning and late in the afternoon, in the early evening, solar and wind, well, solar's dying off in the evening, and wind is dying off in the evening. Solar and wind produce 10%, on average, 10% of their capacity, rated capacity. So if you want their rated capacity, you need to install 10 times as many solar panels and wind turbines. And just for when the days they're operating at their maximum capacity, which is very, very rare. In fact, for 2 months, one of the years, they didn't produce a single bit of electricity. But if you want them to produce at their rated capacity on those few days, then you've got to have transmission lines capable of taking away the power they generate. So what that means is that, first of all, solar and wind are in the bush, in the regions, destroying national parks, destroying pristine rainforests. So that means they're scattered. That means you need more transmission lines over much more distance, which adds not only to the cost, phenomenally to the cost, it takes up more land. But then you have to build 10 times as much to get your rated capacity. And this is insane. It is untenable. And that's what Steve Nowakowski was pointing out. He did a fantastic job, and I encourage him to continue. And I thank him. The next one was to give you an update on the terms of reference inquiry that I initiated in the Senate, and wow, that was fantastic. And I want to compliment the Liberal Party chairman of the inquiry. And by the way, we spoke up, and we've got another at least a half a day, probably a bit more, of the inquiry to go. That'll be scheduled for March, around March 13th, something like that, mid-March. But this inquiry, the last day, which was last week in Canberra, was fabulous. There is unanimous support for a Royal Commission, and not just unanimous, it is unanimous, powerful support. Every single one of the 19 witnesses supported a Royal Commission. Anthony Albanese's whitewash review was absolutely slammed for being exactly what I said it was, a whitewash, to avoid the truth, to avoid the public coming out, to stop the public being heard. The public pressure, we know, is huge. We had one submission there, which is the best submission I have ever seen at a Senate inquiry, put out by a team who've been studying and opposing what went on for years now. They had 47,000 co-signatures, so they called it the People's Submission, and it is the best submission I've ever seen. I also want to, all the submissions were good. Some of them were absolutely phenomenally good. I want to also single out Dr. Scott Prass's submission. You know, I read his submission and was stunned. It was only about 12 pages. It was good. Didn't need to be any longer. He nailed it. And so I thought, who is this man? So I looked him up in Google. He's written 2 books on Royal Commission. That's why he knows his stuff. And he and Julian Gillespie, who led the People's Submission, they're going to get together to refine both submissions and make something that's easier for the committee to digest, because both of them were phenomenal. The answering of questions was phenomenal. So much stuff came out. We did it on live stream. but the video will still be on our Facebook, I think, and probably our YouTube. So get along and have a look at that. It is stunning what came out of that 7 hours of hearings. Remember, Albanese promised to have a royal commission. Why is he running away? What is he hiding? What has he got to hide? The Labor committee that was chaired by a senior Labor senator before the election recommended a royal commission as one of its recommendations, maybe its first. And look, we've had 3 months into the Albanese government, they called an inquiry into the robo-debt fiasco. And that was to get at the previous Liberal National government. We've been going nearly 2 years under this mob, and they still haven't had a royal commission into the biggest and most serious and most deadly event in Australia's history. So the Senate inquiry is now going to be drafting terms of reference. As I said, they'll have another half day, 3/4 of a day of hearings in mid-March. And why do we want to draft those terms of reference? So that when the Royal Commission is called, and I have no doubt it will be called, it's just a matter of time because the pressure is building, then we'll have draft terms of reference ready to go, and we'll have them such that we'll be able to see immediately whether the government is fair dinkum about it. We cannot make the same mistakes again that we've made in the last 4 years in mismanaging grossly COVID. We've also got to recognise that COVID had a disproportionate response. The severity figures show that it was not as severe as some past flus, and it only struck a small percentage of the population, a very small percentage of the population. If you consider the overall population, the severity was very, very low. We have to get to the bottom of this. And this is what I'm about to say came up time and time again. We have to get to the bottom of this to restore trust. People repeatedly said, there is no trust for the health system. There is no trust for the health departments. No trust for the health experts. No trust for politicians, state or federal. And that's deserved, that lack of trust, that withdrawal of trust, because the people were shafted. And the figures on excess mortality show that around about 25,000, 26,000 people, perhaps as high as 30,000, died as a result of homicide. That needs a royal commission, a thorough, objective, open, honest, transparent royal commission with the power to investigate. Albanese's whitewash review is not even allowed to inquire into the states who did most of the implementation. And they're not even allowed to require evidence to be provided. They're not allowed to inquire. How can it be an inquiry? The Royal Commission has the power to subpoena witnesses and to demand evidence. And remember, some of the basic things, apart from the 26,500 to 30,000 people who died as a result of homicide, the mandates were for a vaccine that did not stop transmission. We saw secret health advice that has never been published and is being withheld from being published. The established plans for a pandemic that were planned well before the pandemic, well, it wasn't a pandemic, the plans for handling a pandemic, if it ever arose, were put in place well before the actual virus arrived. I mean, I'm talking about 2019. And yet that plan was ignored after all the work that went into producing the plan. We had lockdowns over a virus as severe as some flus. The severity, as I said, was low to moderate. It was the largest economic and human cost in this country's history. It was the most egregious destruction and withdrawal and theft of property rights and basic freedoms. The underlying evidence that we're told about is secret. We can't even see it. The cost, the $8 billion cost of injections, COVID injections, which are not effective and unsafe, we can't even get the cost of that. Even though we as taxpayers, we all paid for that, the government was just the intermediary, yet the government won't let us see it. The Liberal government didn't at the time. It's now changed its tune in opposition, but now the Labor government and the Greens and Senator Pocock and Senator Lambie won't let us see the documents, won't let us see the contracts. All we want is the truth. That's all. Re-establish trust in governments, departments, and the media. And the people want to be heard. It's fundamental. I represent the people of Queensland and Australia. Every politician in Canberra represents the people of their electorate and the people of Australia. And we are there. We're paid by the taxpayers. We're paid by the voters to be their voice, to be the voice of the people. And most importantly, we don't want a future virus or emergency when we're managing that to be mismanaged. We don't want to make the same mistakes. We can't afford to. Lives are at stake. The economy is at stake. So the terms of reference, first day of hearing last week was just phenomenally powerful. And I want to thank everyone who made a submission, because there were over 500 submissions. They will put out all the submissions eventually. The secretariat of the committee was stunned by the sheer number and quality of submissions, so they're ploughing through them. They'll all come before the committee. Some will be either withheld or they will be published, and because they make adverse comments about named people, they will invite those people to make submissions in response. So it's quite a complex thing that's going on, an inquiry that's going on. Anyway, thank you to everyone, and thank you so much to the participants last week. And by the way, one of the submissions and one of the witnesses was the Australian Midwives and Nursing Association, a conventional union, and they lost a lot of nurses who lost their jobs due to the COVID injection mandates. The union didn't stand up for them, and they didn't mention mandates in their submission. Everyone else did, and yet they want the Royal Commission as well, very strongly demanding a Royal Commission. Okay, let's move on to something that happened yesterday, or during this week anyway. I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll try to hurry along. Casual coal miners, so-called casual coal miners who work a full-time roster, often scheduled out 2 years in advance. Casual miners working in central Queensland or the Hunter Valley are each owed, on average, for wage theft, back pay of around $33,000 per year for every year of service per miner. $33,000 per year. That's the figures, and I'll explain that in a minute. If you're a casual working in central Queensland or the Hunter Valley in the black coal mining sector, you are owed, on average, if you're one of the 5 major enterprise agreements, around $33,000 back pay per year of employment. I moved an amendment that would get these miners their back pay if passed. We had Ralph Babet, myself, Pauline, Jackie Lambie, Tammy Tyrrell, and David Pocock, surprisingly, for once not voting with the Labor Party. The rest voted against it. The Greens voted against it. The Labor Party voted against it unanimously. The Liberals were split. Some of the senior Liberals voted against it. Many of the Liberals just walked straight out the door and abstained. They didn't want to be seen to be going against our amendment. But the amendment got defeated. And in that amendment, we would have made, if it had been passed, the underpayment, the wage theft, is due to 3 main bodies. First of all, some major labour hire firms. One of them is a subsidiary, the Australian subsidiary, of the world's largest labour hire company, a Japanese company, Recruit Holdings. The second, I'll explain it in a minute. So the second one is the CFMEU mining division. The CFMEU, it's now called the Mining and Energy Union, I think. So they'd have to sort out who pays that. But the CFMEU was responsible for this scam, this fraud that has been perpetrated deliberately, knowingly on miners. And the third one is the Fair Work Commission, which is the government entity that approved these bogus awards. So before getting onto the details of that, I want to point out that this bill was passed yet again with another guillotine, in which debate was censored, cut off early before everyone finished their debate, and the discussion on the amendments was non-existent, almost non-existent. I got mine in, but the majority of amendments went through with were voted on without any discussion at all. And some of those amendments were serious. As I said, the Labor Party got hijacked by the Greens when they trusted the Greens on an amendment. So I want to give you some figures. Serious guillotines. That's where, sometimes they're not really serious guillotines, because both Labor and Liberal and the Senate get together and say, look, we don't need to debate this, cut the debate and get on with it. And that's fine. There's no point in wasting time. But serious guillotines, where there's a genuine disagreement between Labor and the LNP, and where there is a need for more debate, these are the figures. In the 45th Parliament under the Turnbull government, there were just 2. In the 46th Parliament, there were a lot more. That was under Morrison. There were 24. Halfway through the 47th Parliament, under Anthony Albanese and the Greens and David Pocock working together in the Senate, there are 39. Just halfway through, that's 78. So about at the rate of 3 times what it's been in the Morrison government. And almost all of the guillotines involve a Labor, Greens, Teal, Pocock coalition. So yesterday we have Senator Thorpe and Senator Pocock amending significant industrial relations legislation affecting many employees, small businesses and employers. Yet we have limited time. We had limited time to assess and almost no time to debate. For most of the amendments, no time to debate. They went through and we saw what happened. People could end up in jail because of the Greens amendment that the Labor Party mustn't have even read. We voted against it. I explained in great detail in my second reading speech the night before what I believe is the largest systemic wage theft in Australia, and I foreshadowed my amendment. Labor's bill, instead of holding the CFMEU union bosses, the labour hire firms and the Fair Work Commission accountable and responsible for that fraud, that scam, that wage theft, Australia's largest wage theft, instead of holding the guilty people responsible, they're now giving the union bosses more power with this latest loopholes bill, so-called loopholes. And there's no loophole. The permanent casual rort can be solved with just a simple enforcement of the Fair Work Act. And that's what Labor's doing. They are changing the Fair Work Act so that the guilty cannot be held accountable and made responsible, and so that minors will not get their back pay. They'll close it down. That's what they're doing. They're trying to hide it. We commissioned a report. I haven't got it with me. We commissioned a report, independent experts, lawyers, industrial relations practitioners, and mine workers. It's a thorough report. So normally, when you have casuals, I won't go into all the details. When you have an award rate of pay, you paid say so much. When you employ casuals, they're supposed to be given a loading. So they have to have at least the award rate and then another 25% on top. Well, get this. There's no 25% on top. And two of the enterprise agreements, the casual rate is actually less than the permanent rate. And yet the Fair Work Commission signed off. Yet the CFMEU signed off, agreed with it. And who made off with that money? The labour hire firms. That's who made off with the money. The CFMEU union bosses negotiated and approved this wage theft. And I'll just quickly go to another section. The minister is now rewarding union bosses by hiding them, rewarding labour hire firms by hiding them, rewarding the Fair Work Commission by hiding it. This is not right. This is totally wrong. And they're doing it. Well, I won't go into any more details because I've got time is up, I think. So I'll just mention one other thing that I didn't think of before. So what you can see is that the Labor amendment, the voting results. The Greens oppose my amendment for giving these casuals their fair back pay up to $33,000 on average per person per year. The Labor Party opposed it. Some of the Liberals opposed it. The other Liberals abstained. So, and for those who want a very short summary, if you subscribe to the Australian newspaper, go to Robert Gottliebsen's article, which came out yesterday morning. Fabulous article. I've had several senators coming to me and saying that Gottliebsen's article, Robert Gottliebsen in the Australian on Thursday, the 8th of February, is a fabulous summary if you want a quick summary. I want to mention one other thing, and that is the Digital Identity Bill inquiry that is going on today. That's why I stayed back in Canberra after the Senate rose yesterday to take part in that inquiry. And boy, does that need a lot of work. We're opposed to it anyway, but it needs a lot of work. Some questioning by the senators on the inquiry, including myself, exposed the fact that is a completely underdone and loose and sloppy piece of legislation. And I want to compliment Green Senator David Shoebridge, who on matters like this does a bloody good job. So he asked some really good questions, but all of the non-aligned senators asked some fine questions. But that's a dog of a bill, and it needs to be very heavily refined. Okay, so I'll turn it open to question and answer. I'll run late by a few minutes. I've got a radio interview, and then I jump on a plane. So any questions? John Roberts says, this is a transfer of wealth from the poor to left-wing billionaires and multimillionaires. I guess you're talking about the solar and wind, the reckless solar and wind, and to communist China. You are correct, yet people still think this will change the weather. People have been dumbed down in this country thanks to the media. You nailed it. I don't have to add anything to that. It's the parasitic behavior of multi-billionaires and other predators in the associated with the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. And Avi Yemeni, thanks, mate, for interviewing and holding accountable Twiggy Forrest attending the World Economic Forum at Davos. I love that short little clip, mate. He didn't make much sense, did he? Good on you, Avi. Sideshow Bob, I love your picture there, mate. Tucker Putin interview was worth the watch. Thanks, Mal. Yes, I've only just started watching it. I've only watched the first 8 minutes while I was eating my lunch, and I think that Putin, it's potentially one of the most powerful interviews ever. I haven't watched it, so I can't endorse it, but I'm looking forward to watching it when I get the chance. But I think that it will be very powerful for two reasons, and I've heard good comments about it so far. It's a bit slow to get going because Putin goes into the history of what's happening in Ukraine. And it's centuries old, what's going on. But essentially, what Tucker Carlson is doing by giving Putin an opportunity to air his view, you don't have to agree with it. Tucker says he's not necessarily pushing either side, but he wants to give both sides a voice. Giving both sides a voice will expose what's really going on and hold both sides accountable. That will be the best way of stopping World War III. The other thing is that I believe that Putin has said that one of the problems is that the United States government has been hijacked by the globalists. Well, we know that. So that's confirmation. And hopefully the American people, this will be another chink in the American people waking up and reclaiming their government and stopping these globalist parasites. And meanwhile, in Australia, we have to stop feeding these parasitic behaviours from some of these globalist billionaires, making off with our electricity. Anyone who uses electricity or has land or uses electricity is paying to these parasitic billionaires. I see nothing. I love your picture. The Greens are destroying the world in the hope of saving it. They've never had the hope of saving it. Never. That's never been their intent. Their intent, mate, has been to control the world. And that's coming out of the mouths of senior UN bureaucrats. The Greens are the foot soldiers of the World Economic Forum and United Nations alliance that was formed in 2018. They're allied. And the Greens implement their policies, and then they're taken up by the Labor Party, then they're taken up by the Liberal Party, so that the Unity Party ends up having it. I've just had a note from one of my team. He asked me to remind people that over 1,300 pages of legislation has been rushed through by this Labor Party in serious guillotines. You know, I've been complaining and highlighting for years now that the Fair Work Act was 650 pages long. It's far, far too long. Far, far too long. There's no way a worker or a small business person could ever comprehend. They wouldn't have the time to go into it. And it's there to protect the union bosses, protect the large multinationals, protect the employer or industry organizations, protect lawyers, and protect HR consultants. It's been tripled. It's now 1,900 pages, I'm guessing. 650 plus 1,300, all pushed through without serious debate. So I just saw someone there just posted a comment, Albo's broken promises. Mate, the real issue in this government, Albo promised a lot. Carlix, Albo promised a lot. He promised a lot and he has failed to deliver on many. The real issue in this country now is that the Prime Minister cannot be trusted. That's a very serious issue and it's quite clear. Okay, I think my time is getting close. Queensland Health is a shambles. Yes, Rod, it absolutely is. We have nurses still stood down. We were talking to nurses at the terms of reference Senate inquiry last week, and one of the nurses representatives from the Nurses Professional Association of Queensland, who had two fabulous representatives there, Ella, she said that a nurse was at work and had been sacked just last week. She herself had been sacked on January the 2nd this year. This year. I mean, this is insane. And why were they sacked? Because they didn't comply with the mandates. Simple. And we've got so many thousands of nurses stood down. We've got hundreds of doctors who've lost their jobs or quit. Bright young doctors in some cases, done their training and really in it for the right reasons, left. And we wonder why Queensland Health is in a shambles. Ambulance ramping because there aren't enough beds, just enough people to check an emergency. Just disgraceful. And we see people with dramatically increased incidence of turbo cancers, diabetes, Alzheimer's. And these diseases, I'll be doing a speech on these causes of excess mortality that are now showing up. And it all goes down to the cause is completely clear. It goes down to the plasma gate and the use of E. coli bacteria and DNA fragments. Well, I better go. I've just had a reminder from my staff because I've got to do a radio interview and then I've got to catch a plane. So look forward to being back in Queensland for 36 hours and thanks very much for listening in. See you next week.